This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends.
Running a business comes with a lot of what ifs, but luckily there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Hello and welcome to Exvangelical, a show exploring the world inside and outside the evangelical subculture. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. It's been a minute since I posted here to this feed, and I apologize for that. It's been quite a bit of a whirlwind offline for myself at my work and other things, but I did want to refresh this feed and also just mention that I have a couple of other projects that you can find in other feeds as I continue to decide what to make of this particular feed and this particular show. What I mean by that is oftentimes I am focusing on these author interviews, and some of my interest is expanding beyond what I've typically followed and featured here, which is deconstruction-oriented conversations or conversations around Christian nationalism and other related topics. There are further related topics that I want to explore and speak to thinkers and writers about, and those include things across the gamut. And so I have started a new podcast feed called The Good Books, and you can find a link to that in the show notes. I'm also publishing those interviews on YouTube now. You can also find that link there. And then in addition to that, I'm also going to be producing a show with my friend Scott Okamoto called Let's Talk About Text. And that is a show where we talk about what we're reading and as a celebration of reading. So it's a very different type of show than both this show, Exvangelical, as well as The Good Books, in that it is intended to be a bit escapist and a bit about just exploring and talking about what is feeding us, because that is just as important as dwelling on a lot of the things that are wrong with society. About those things. It's just as integral to moving forward with life and living a well-rounded and abundant life than just focusing on the things that we've had to overcome, such as what we often focus on here. So I will link all of that in the show notes, and I will return to working on this particular feed and this particular show. If I'm being open with you as a listener, I've sort of struggled to know exactly what else to say that wasn't already written in my book that I published last September, that other people weren't already saying, that didn't feel as if it was just either woe is me or just lamenting over being a Cassandra of some sort, of not of all of the people that tried to speak up over the last near decade regarding the threats of Trumpism and the power of the Christian right, and to see those things just come back into power in such full force over the first few months of the second Trump administration has just been difficult to process, and not knowing exactly what to say. But I am back in a position where I am recording and publishing these things, and I'm hopeful, and I do think that hope is a choice. So I'm choosing to be hopeful, even when that in and of itself can be difficult, because I do think that imagination and hope are the things that help us build as opposed to just destroy. And that is what we're seeing in effect here in the United States governance, is such a focus on destruction, of tearing down institutions, of destabilizing things to serve the most powerful in society and continue to inflict harm and damage upon those who have the least. And that is a heavy burden that we all bear in our own ways and with our own concomitant privileges and obligations. So I will be returning to this, even though it can be heavy work. But I am considering the best way to use this platform, the best way to use this particular show to highlight those things. And they don't always just have to be these author interviews. And they have their own place, and they have a great value to me. But yeah, I wanted to open with that a little bit of a preface before I share with you my most recent interview that I did with Lucas F.W. Wilson, who is the editor of an anthology. You'll hear his full introduction here in just a moment. As always, you can keep up with me and what I'm doing at postevangelicalpost.com. That is my newsletter. It is currently hosted on Substack. You can support me directly there, or you can just follow along for free as well. If you have any questions, you can email me at contact@exevangelicalpodcast.com. Thank you very much. Let's get right to the interview. Here we go. All right. My guest today is Lucas F.W. Wilson. Lucas is an activist, an academic, and survivor of conversion therapy. He's written about conversion therapy for The Advocate, Queerty, LGBTQ Nation, The Chronicle of Higher Education, Religion Dispatches, Into RVA Magazine, and Whosoever. He's also currently on a Justice Canada-funded conversion therapy ban advisory committee through Wisdom to Action. In addition to that, he is also the editor of the anthology Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy, which we'll be discussing today. Lucas, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And I apologize. I actually didn't ask if he, him was your pronouns. I forgot to ask that in the pre-run.
Use whatever you want. Okay, yeah, great. But he, him works.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you. Whoa, my camera's doing this weird thing. I guess I shouldn't move.
It's like you have a camera person. That's kind of cool.
Well, aside from being distracted by my camera, the book is very moving. It's visceral, it's difficult, it's inspiring, it's vulnerable. But before we get to that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your own story and what led you into doing this sort of work, both through writing as well as in the academic sphere. Mm-hmm. So let's just start sort of at the beginning. How did you get involved in church life? Were you raised in the church, or was it through another path?
You know what? I actually have my phone right here, and the back of my phone is a family photo that was taken at church when this is Mary here at the bottom, the little mulleted child. And we went to church when I was really little, but by the time I was in about grade 2 or 3, we stopped going to church. Like any good Canadian family, we went to the cottage instead and just sort of skipped over that. And even when we were, in church when I was younger, it was on and off. And so at the end of the day, like I always say now that I was not raised in a Christian home. I was born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So, not exactly the most religious of places, both Canada, writ large, but also Toronto specifically. It's not the most Christian place, I should say. And so my dad was agnostic. My mom was, haunted by her Baptist demons. And then, that sort of took a toll in indirect ways on me throughout my life. But yeah, we weren't really religious. Like even when we went to church, it was like you'd go to church and you'd come home and you'd shut the hell up about it, right? We didn't talk about Jesus. Like I learned my prayers and I learned, how to say grace. And that was sort of the extent of my religious training, at least within the home. And so I didn't really have much exposure to religion otherwise. Maybe if we went to church at my aunt's or uncle's on like a random weekend when we were out of town or at my grandparents' or whatever, like that was kind of it. But we really weren't a religious family. So when I was going into high school, my brother got really into the creation versus evolution debate.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And he did so by way of Ken Ham. And Ken Ham's that, he's a convicted, I guess, felon at this point, but he's the one who said that it wasn't the government's money, it was God's money. So he wasn't going to give them any money, but the government seemed to disagree and he went to jail for a while. So that was Ken Ham. He was that, Dr. Dino or whatever, and he wasn't a real doctor. He had like a degree from a degree mill, but neither here nor there. He was the reason why really I got got into creation versus evolution and ultimately into the church. And so my brother, showed me these like DVDs back when DVDs were a thing. And, I watched
Mm.
all of these sort of debates that this guy, Dr. Dino Kenthoven, did with these different, scientists and academics and whatnot. And so that really hooked me. And then I decided, okay, if I believe that there's a creator, I should go and, figure out who this creator is. And for me at the time, the logical step was to go to the church that I had gone to on and off again when I was younger. And so I did. And that's where I stayed for all of high school. And then eventually I went to Liberty University. But before Liberty, in high school, I was, like a zealot for Jesus. I was on fire for God and, was one
Hmm.
of the, the faithful. But a few years after Liberty, I don't think you can use that to describe me anymore. I'm not a person of faith, thank goodness, or even thank God. So I eventually went to Liberty, and then I went to grad school after that. And grad school, I always say, saved my life in the sense that if I hadn't have gone to grad school and just kept going down the road I was going, I probably would have been married to a woman. And that's not a problem for a lot of people, but for a gay man, it would be a problem. And so being a gay man, that didn't seem like it was in the cards for me, and it certainly wasn't. And so we can talk more about Liberty, which I think, goes into the conversation we'll have today about same-sex attraction, because I relay a story within that collection about my time there, specifically in the group conversion therapy program.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So interesting that it was the sort of apologetics angle that got you and your brother into that. And would the church that you attended, did it have like a denominational affiliation, or was it just like a non-denominational Bible believing type
It
church?
was a quote unquote Bible believing church, but it was a fellowship
Sure.
evangelical Baptist church, which, if I'm not mistaken, I think there are actually churches in the US that also are FEBs, Fellowship Evangelical Baptist churches, but it's comparable to like Southern Baptist as far as like theology goes.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm certainly not nearly as versed in like Protestant denominations in Canada as I am in the United States. That's just my own bias and experience there. But yeah, so does Liberty have a sort of networking or like marketing strategy for Canada? Like what led you from Toronto to Virginia
Yeah.
and choosing Liberty?
It's funny that you asked that because my uncle was the national recruiter in Canada for Liberty. And so,
Really?
yeah,
Okay.
just as it happened. And so I was planning on going to the small Bible college out in Saskatchewan until I started thinking, oh, maybe I'll just go to University of Toronto and study there. And now looking back, it's so crazy that, eventually I did decide between the University of Toronto and Liberty, like Canada's best university, and then the US, one of the worst universities in the US. And so so I was deciding between which school to go to. My uncle had said, hey, you should come down and visit. And I thought, like, no chance in hell am I going to Virginia. Like, as a young Torontonian, like, that doesn't sound like that much fun, like going to the US South. Maybe New York City or San Francisco or Chicago sounds cool, but like going to like Lynchburg, Virginia didn't seem like the most exciting prospect. But I did. He convinced me, and I went down. And I think one thing that is a big difference between Canada and the US is how people perceive university and like the college experience. Like in Canada, it's so lackluster in comparison. Like people don't really care. Like you don't like go to like homecoming games nearly as much as you see people in the States do that. Or like people don't have the same school spirit as they do in Canada as they do in the US. Like the sports events are huge in the US, and in Canada that just kind of isn't a thing. You have like 20 people who go to like the football game or like the hockey game, right? And so
Yeah.
it's quite boring in comparison. And so I think for me, when I went down and I saw this like squeaky clean campus, and it was huge at the time, and it's gotten even bigger since, and all these like Christian young people, I thought that was like so cool that it was something that I had not really seen in person, because again, I'd never gone to any university, let alone a Christian university. And so when I saw that, and I thought, well, if I were to stay at home and go to U of T, it'd be kind of boring in comparison. But on top of all of that, it was a really exciting, campus for, a young evangelical. I think for anyone else, it wouldn't have been all that exciting because, well, it's like,
Right.
chips and dip kind of fun versus, actually having, a regular sort of like Friday or Saturday night. And so for me, it was super exciting. And I thought like, everything's bigger in the US. And so I thought like, this is the place for me. And when I was there, actually, on one of the trips that I went down, I eventually went down 6 times, which looking back is sort of excessive. But I was there, and it was in chapel, what they call convocation. And so on the screens that project the worship lyrics, there were these different like on-campus advertisements for things that you could do. And one of the advertisements was, it said something along the lines of like, are you struggling with same-sex attraction? And I was like, oh shit, like, yeah, that's me. Or I would have said, oh shoot, of course, at the time, right? And so I said, like, that's me. And so I clocked it, and I took a mental note, like this guy, his name was Dane Emmerich. And so I went up to a friend later and I was like, yo, who's this Dane Emmerich guy? Like, what's his business? What's his deal? And so, my friend was like, oh, he's the guy who deals with two different groups of students. One, those who are quote unquote addicted to porn, which of course research suggests you cannot be addicted to porn. And then two, the other group, those who are quote unquote addicted to homosexuality, right? And again, obviously not an addiction, but that's how it was of course framed at Liberty. And so when I was eventually making my decision of where I was going to go, a big part of that decision was the fact that they had this program. And I didn't conceptualize it at the time as conversion therapy. I just thought of it as, I could go and talk to this pastor and become straight. And so I thought, well, I have to become straight eventually because, I got to marry a woman and, you live my sort of evangelical life. And so it just made more sense to me at the time that I would go there and go through that program eventually, which I did. But that was definitely a big motivating factor as to why I went to the university.
Yeah. Yeah. And at that point, you were aware, and I actually became like you said, an attraction or something that was compelling about choosing Liberty is that at the time you were framing it as you were struggling with same-sex attraction, and that this was a place that could help you address that. Was that something that you just had, and you can feel free to decline this question, but was this something that you were only sort of dealing with privately, or was it something that members of your either friends or family or people at your youth group or whatever else might have been also aware of, or that would have been a compelling reason to choose Liberty for your college? Because that's a big choice, right? That's a big life choice to your choice of college. And I'm also a Christian college grad, so I understand all the different calculuses.
Where did you go?
That you make. I went to Indiana Wesleyan. So
okay.
Yeah. But I graduated in 2005, so I was probably a few years before you were at school. But nonetheless, amongst those, when you were making those choices, and this being a factor, was that something that you had talked to anyone else about, or was it at that point a private struggle?
No, it's definitely private. I don't think I came out to anyone other than I think it was like, what was that website called? MySpace? Remember MySpace? There was one guy on MySpace I told, and I remember thinking like, this is wild. I finally told someone, but that was, in high school. No, but I actually did tell people once I was at Liberty, but before I went to the school, no, like no one knew. This was definitely a private, people knew. Like I watched a lot of HGTV, you know what I mean? Like the writing was on the wall. People knew, but I just didn't verbalize it. You know what I'm saying? I think that, and I went to like Rosedale Heights School of the Arts, like give me a break, but for high school, but eventually I did tell people, but verbally or explicitly, I didn't tell anyone ahead of time. It was once I was there that I started opening up to people, both there and at home. But it was very select few. Like it was not like I was out there, advertising it, because obviously that's not street cred at Liberty University or like within the evangelical world to be a big old homo. So I definitely kept that up, under wraps for the most part, and only shared it with, people I really trusted and thought could even help me, quote unquote, overcome the quote unquote sin.
Mm-hmm. And was that the context in which you personally underwent conversion therapy type, and I'm going to put air quotes for people that aren't watching the video, treatment for this sort of thing? That was the context in which you entered those environments.
Yeah, so Liberty, so again, they had this program, they had programs, I should say, they're plural, like multiple programs in operation, mostly run by this one guy, Dane Emmerich, this pastor who was like a paid university staff member who transitioned out of his role as Dean of Men and then into a campus care / campus pastor position, whatever you want to call it. And so I knew that they had the programs. And so what happened was that it was like 2 weeks into school, and, I was there, and my spiritual life director made a move on me in my dorm, and I sort of acquiesced, and, that was that. But then afterwards, he wouldn't talk to me. Like, he refused to speak to me. And so I remember I was, on this campus where, I had this like sort of like weird, bizarre encounter, one of my first like sexual encounters, and he wouldn't talk to me. And so like, I was like 18 at the time, and I sort of was like muzzled. Like I couldn't go and like tell my friends, and I couldn't, tell the administration. I couldn't call people. I couldn't tell my mom, obviously, like my mom didn't know, surprisingly, that it was, that it was gay. But, eventually what happened was my one friend, he and I were at my work, and I worked at the switchboard, and I could have friends over. And so we were sitting in, the switchboard office just chatting, and he knew something was up. Like he knew that there was a problem between me and my SLD, my spiritual life director, but he didn't know what. And so he's like, well, come on, tell me what happened. I was like, I can't tell you, you judge me, blah, blah, blah. But I said, but I did write a poem about it. And so I said, can I read you the poem? And I love reading my work. I love, like sharing it because, obviously like you write it in a certain way that it's in your head. And so anyway, I was like, I'll read you this poem. So I read him the poem, and then afterwards he looked at me, and whenever we talked about anything sort of like remotely sexual, his lips would quiver like my grandma's. I remember my grandma's lips used to always quiver, and his did too. And so his started quivering, and he said, oh, look, I think I know what your poem's about. And I was like, oh shoot, my cover's blown. Like he knows. And I said, well, what do you think it is? And he said, well, I can't guess because if I'm wrong, I'll be embarrassed. I said, why would you be embarrassed? He says, well, I think I struggle with the same thing. And I'm like, wait a second, like struggle. And, of course, like quote unquote, struggling with same sex attraction is code for you're gay. But I thought like, it felt like almost like a dog whistle, like saying he was struggling with something. He didn't say like, oh, it's, something else. The way he framed it just sounded to me like, wait a second, we might be actually on the same page. And so back and forth, we sort of fumbled with, what we were trying to figure out the other person, quote unquote, struggled with. And then we were both like, oh, I struggle with same sex attraction. Oh, I struggle with same sex attraction. And then, from there we started talking. But again, like I didn't really want to only burden him with this, right? Like, so if I tell him and then, it's only him that knows, and, like he has to shoulder that himself with me. Like I didn't want to be, annoying to a friend. And so I said, well, you know what, I'm going to fast track my idea of going to conversion therapy because I didn't plan to go right away. I was planning on going later on. I was like, well, I'll fast track it. I'll go and then sort of get it over with and, become straight. And so that's what prompted me once I was there. It was like 2 weeks into school. And then I made like a fake email account. It was like, I was trying to figure out like, how can I make an email that's as different from like 18-year-old me as possible? So it was something like Texas football fan or something like that. And I'm like, this gay kid from Toronto. And so I sent him an email to the conversion therapist, and I said, hey, would I be able to come talk to you? Like, would you tell on me kind of thing? And he's like, nope, whatever you tell me, as long as you're not going to self-harm, we can, it's all confidential. And so I went and I met with him over the span of 4 years, and I met with him one-on-one in like the individual program, but I also went to the group program, but I only went to the group program once. And that group program is actually the story that I recount in Shame, Sex, Attraction. But the other story of me going one-on-one, that's the story that I'll be writing for my next book, which I'm currently working on. And so that'll be out later. But yeah, that's how it sort of came about, was because of this weird sort of like romantic tryst with my spiritual life director on my hall.
Yeah. Wow. So let's talk about the anthology. My show's bias is very much on Christianity, but your authors actually, the selection of the various authors within the anthology, they make clear that homophobia and things like conversion therapy practice style abuses are present in lots of faith traditions, including things like Judaism and Falun Dafa. On that note, what are some of the like common threads that really bind these sorts of abuses, practices together, and the ways that like these sort of heteronormative beliefs express themselves through all these faiths? Are there things that are common, and even like drawing upon some of your other academic work, like what sets these things sort of apart from one another, and what are the common points? Because I was sort of like, I obviously through doing this work have heard lots of stories of Christian conversion therapy, but the other ones were surprising in their own right.
So what I will say first of all is that although conversion therapy or conversion practices writ large, or more broadly defined, are not exclusive to Christianity, they are disproportionately practiced within conservative Christian context. And so that is certainly, and I think the collection reflects that, right? The majority of the stories included are from Christian context. But like you said, not all of them. And, even conversion practices, they didn't even have their genesis in Christianity. They actually were first sort of done in secular context, in medical and psychiatric context specifically. And so, once the 70s hit, then of course, these ex-gay groups, particularly in California, start cropping up. These religious Christian, conservative Christian ex-gay groups start popping up. And then eventually it sort of snowballs into this big industry, this big movement. And then it gets, it has a sort of like a downfall a little bit in like the early 2000s and then into like, the mid 2000s, but then has sort of seen an uptick again as of recent, or maybe it's just not an uptick, it's just never gone away. But that's within Christian context. But if you're thinking about, Jewish context, or you're thinking about, Falun Dafa, or, there's obviously conversion practices happening in Muslim context. There's conversion practices happening in secular context, right? Like it wasn't even long ago that there were still conversion practices happening in a really prominent clinic in Toronto that again has no religious affiliation. And so all of this is to say that, again, it's across the board, it's all over. These practices are ubiquitous, but again, highly or disproportionately practiced within Christian context. But for the unifying thread, like what actually, what are the similarities? I think there are a number. First of all, it's predicated upon conversion ideology, all of these practices. And the ideology is that being queer, being non-normative, whether it be in regards to one's sexuality or to regards to one's gender, is something that needs to be fixed. Whether it's a sin, whether it's a social pathology, whether it's, this idea that, it's a gender deficit. There's all sorts of different theories. It's an addiction, right? That's framed in multiple different ways, though oftentimes those different framings actually work together and are understood in tandem. So, although it might be understood predominantly as a sin, it also is understood as a social, pathology, a threat that is contagious, right? Particularly to children, again, according to how these people frame it. And so the ideology certainly is a parallel, right? Like it's believing that something needs to be fixed, something needs to be repaired. The other part, though, is the consequences and also really what brings people into these, spaces, right? So again, the title of the book is Shame, Sex, Attraction. Of course, a play on the phrase same-sex attraction, which is just code for being gay in Christian context or queer in Christian context. But I think that shame is not, and the reason why the title is what it is, because shame is both that which oftentimes brings people into conversion therapy, right? Like not always. Some people are forced into it and just have to sort of endure it until they, say, oh, I'm better now, or I fixed it, and then they can get their parents off their back, and then off they can go and do their own thing. And for a lot of them, then they don't feel shame, right? But for those who do go in, quote unquote, willfully, or with, a sense of agency, and we can talk more about agency, or, what it means to choose to go into conversion therapy. Like, what does it mean to choose to do this? We can talk later. But with that, nonetheless, the main motivator is really shame, right? And shame is a social emotion. It's a social affect. It's something that you feel when in relationship to another, right? You see another person and it's through their gaze that you feel ashamed, right? You don't necessarily feel ashamed by yourself. You're only going to really feel ashamed when someone sees you for either who you are, or, what you are. And again, obviously always framed in a pejorative or negative way. And so shame is really what brings people into conversion therapy, but it's also that which is the number one consequence of conversion therapy, right? So in a recent Canadian study, they were talking about what are the consequences of conversion therapy, and they were asking survivors, and survivors said the number one answer that they said was shame. And so I think that this is certainly, a big unifying thread throughout these different contexts, that what we see is the motivating factor and the number one consequence of conversion practices is shame. Again, the ideology is oftentimes the same, and it's really, again, at its core, it's just saying that someone needs to be fixed, someone needs to be cured of this ailment, whatever this ailment is. Again, if it's, in regards to one's gender or sexuality, depending, or sometimes both, depending on the context. So I would say these are the two, or I guess technically three things that really are unified these practices across the board.
Yeah. Yeah. And to build off of what you said about talking about agency, I think that for folks who maybe don't have the lived experience of being in one of these conservative, predominantly Christian spaces, they don't necessarily understand why someone sticks around. Why they don't just like get the fuck out of Dodge or whatever. Yeah. But as you said, some people do enter into these things out of a sense of obligation or whatever else. And I do believe that the text, it's the various stories that are included in the anthology really, really illustrate that. But could you talk just a little bit about some of that and what the sort of compulsion is, whether it's from your own experience or from drawing on your further work in this space, that can flesh that out a little bit and what that looks like? Because even when I was trying to think about how to phrase these questions, I didn't necessarily want to imply that someone necessarily chose this of their own volition. I think some people do, but some people may be compelled by force to do so. And the stories are so varied. So what does that aspect of entering into these treatments that lead to abuse and lead to this sense of shame, how is that that seems to be a major part of these stories.
Yeah. So oftentimes, pardon me, all the time, within high control Christian context, homosexuality is framed as a sin. And it is also framed as something where if you choose your sin, right, just choosing to be yourself, you are therefore not choosing God. You're not faithful. And therefore, there are a lot of consequences. And, the biggest consequence of which would, of course, be the fact that these folks believe that if you are choosing yourself over God and that's a way of denying God, then, it's blasphemous. Then really, even though they wouldn't necessarily say this about other sins that people struggle with, like, for instance, alcoholism or, whatever else they frame as a sin, that they would say that you're going to go to hell because you've chosen that, right? Even, again, if someone's struggling with alcoholism their whole life, and this is not me saying that homosexuality is comparable to alcoholism, this is me saying that these folks compare the two as quote unquote sins or, struggles, that they wouldn't say, oh, he's therefore going to go to hell. It would just be that, oh, well, that was a struggle and it was obviously sad and blah, blah, blah. Whereas if someone, goes and lives that big gay lifestyle, whatever the hell that is, well, then they've, of course, chosen themselves and not chosen God. So it's this way of saying that if you are to just be yourself, if you are to be queer, whether it be genderqueer or, queer in a sexual sense, that you are choosing yourself, therefore you're not choosing God, therefore you're going to hell. And of course, like, this is a really strong motivator for people to conform to whatever, they're expected to conform to, right? And so, for me, I remember like thinking to myself, well, if I have to choose between God and myself, of course I'm choosing God, right? I can't choose my sin, my sexuality over and above God. Like, God comes first. And so, when you're in that really, again, it's a high control religious space, you don't have the ability to choose or exercise agency in the same way, because again, a lot of your decisions are made for you. You don't really have a choice on what you're going to do in X, Y, and Z context. Instead, you are told to do this and this, and that's what, that's the script you're given. And evangelicalism, of course, follows a number of scripts, whether they'll be gender scripts or, sexual scripts, right? That you have to have sex only within monogamous, man and woman, male and female, quote unquote, relationship. And that, you have to act a certain way if you're, a man, and, act in a sort of like godly masculine way, and then, or a godly feminine way, whatever that is. And so we have all these scripts that we follow. And so evangelicalism scripts us into this, and they do it by way of like emotional manipulation, of course, right? Like, again, right, to say that someone's going to lose, their salvation and then go to hell, or that they're also going to lose their community, right? These are two big, motivating factors, that you're not only going to not really have a family, depending on your family, if they're, accepting or not. But if you have a homophobic or transphobic family and you lose them, and then on top of that, you lose your friends in your church community, and then on top of that, you lose your relationship with God, and then on top of all of that, you'll see none of them in eternity. Gee whiz, you're going to follow, right? And so that's a huge motivating sort of reason why so many people go into this when they're coming from these, evangelical white Christian fundamentalists or just white Christian nationalists, whatever context, like Pentecostal and beyond. And so for me, when I think now about the idea of choice or agency, I struggle with that because I don't want to sort of absolve myself and say, oh, it wasn't my fault, I did nothing. Like, there was no part, I had no part. That's not what I'm trying to do. But instead, I think about it, what is it? But again, if we understand conversion therapy as abuse, because it is definitional abuse, and, if we understand the UN Rapporteur on Torture's, estimation of conversion practices as a form of torture, what does it mean to consent to abuse? What does it mean to consent to torture, right? And I think for conversion therapy survivors, when we say that, we chose to do it, again, what does that mean? Like, how do we consent to that? And we would never say to, a person who was in a marriage that was, or in a relationship that when they were abused, oh, you chose to be there. It's like, no, you were there and this happened, right? And so again, and they might have stayed in that relationship. Does that mean we blame them? No, because there are obviously a lot of complicating factors as to why they would have done that. And of course, conversion therapy and your relationship with your conversion therapist and then with the greater evangelical community is oftentimes, if not always, an abusive relationship, right? And so that being said, yes, I chose to do it, but at the same time, I do acknowledge the situation or the context in which I found myself, and the context in which a lot of survivors find themselves when they go into conversion therapy and when they come out.
Mm-hmm. Another element of these stories is just how sort of, I used the word visceral earlier, but the other word that comes to mind is embodied, which like is getting a lot of play. I think a lot of our language is warming to those sorts of ideas. But what I mean by that is like the collection opens with the story of someone who's encouraged by the person that they entrusted to quote unquote treat or lead them, they're encouraged to smell feces to discourage like automatic thoughts,
Hmm.
essentially. And another, there's someone who's seeking to be freed from their desires, but then finds themselves attracted to the Pentecostal preacher who's like, and it's those moments that really stick with the reader that really indicate the just the way in which sexuality is so innate to us, and that it can also be entangled with spirituality or with those sorts of things.
Hmm.
Like what is it about when one of your contributors, recalls these things that brings back those visceral memories and the way in which these things were experienced? Because I mean, even secondhand, even through the remove of being the reader, that intensity is felt, and it's very powerful. But what is it about those moments that make them so memorable for the survivors themselves?
Hmm. I mean, I think that a lot of the practices that we talk about, the conversion practices that we talk about, were physical, right? And so, like, you're talking about the one guy who was told to like smell human excrement. You know, there's the other guy who has the preacher, the Pentecostal preacher, sitting on his chest and essentially trying to exorcise a demon from him. You know, other contributor, this Nathan Z story is Away and Away, which is just like unbelievably beautifully written. And his story about how he was losing clumps of hair while his mom and in some ways his dad were his conversion therapist, right? And like for me, like I think about, my experience in conversion therapy. I don't talk about this one as much. Actually, I don't talk about this aspect at all in the story that's included, but it will be in the next one. Is when my conversion therapist, there was always a tactile aspect to it, right? And so what he would do is he always give me these big bear hugs at the beginning and ending of every session, which looking back is just so bizarre. But then on top of that, he would always put his hands on me when we prayed, whether it be on my shoulder or on my leg. And as I was talking with someone else who went through his conversion therapy program as well, he was saying that when he put his hands on his leg, he always think to himself like, it's not like high enough that it's like too weird, but it's also not low enough that it's not weird. Like it was always this sort of like, wait a second, is this okay? Like, why are you doing this? And whatever. And so I think for a lot of us, there was definitely the visceral aspect in that sense, like, or so the physical aspect in that sense. But there's also the visceral aspect. And this is when I think about emotions, right? Because emotions really are these felt registers or these embodied registers of, of sort of like information, right? So when we feel, for instance, ashamed, we don't think right away, oh, I'm ashamed. We feel it before we think it. It's pre-linguistic, right? When we have sort of shock or horror, we don't think right away, oh, how horrifying, right? We instead feel the horror. And so I think that these stories, like, how could they not be visceral, and how could the reader not see or sort of like second-handedly experience what these folks went through? Because of course the stories themselves were incredibly emotionally laden, that they were experiencing emotions themselves, and of course writing these stories clearly brought up emotions for contributors. But on top of that, there was the physical aspect with so many of these stories that I think really force the reader to encounter their experience in a way that is incredibly uncomfortable. And the way that I actually, when I was editing and working with authors, on their stories, I never changed the content, because who am I to change the content? That would be, or content that would simply be untrue. But instead, we changed the form. We changed how are we going to tell these stories. And so initially, there were a number of contributors who had written, endings that were quite different from what they eventually wrote. And that's not to say that they changed what happened in the story. Like, no, it's just that we bookended the story at a different place. We didn't end the story, years after the experience. We instead ended it right in the experience, or like a day after, as opposed to saying, oh, some people had me on a paragraph or two saying, and then, 20 years later, I was able to come to terms with my sexuality and I feel good. Now, that we cut all that. We got rid of that because that gives the reader what the reader's really looking for. And the reader's looking for some sort of resolution, right? The reader's looking for, how did this person end like his or her or their sort of like experience, and then what did they do after, and how did they come to terms with it? Because obviously those who are writing these stories for the collection have come to terms. In this case, literally, like they come to terms, or language, or ways of sort of verbalizing, talking about their experience. But I didn't want readers to walk away with a sense of resolution, because for those of us who went through conversion therapy, we didn't get that resolution, right? It took years. So we didn't get it right away. It wasn't immediate. And so I didn't want readers to have that. And I wanted readers to sit in the uncomfortability of these situations that these folks went through. And so we cut what would have given readers perhaps some sort of catharsis or release and said, well, now they're fine. And again, they are fine in a lot of ways now that they've, been, 10, 20, well, sometimes one or two, but oftentimes like 10 or 20 years out of these experiences. But again, I wanted people to sit with those emotions and to be uncomfortable because we were made uncomfortable for a long time. And I wanted people to have at least the smallest window into that experience. And that's why the endings are so abrupt for a lot of the stories, or tragic. Because again, these stories for us were tragic and they were difficult. And again, we just wanted a little bit of a window into that experience. And that's how we sort of went about it.
Right. Well, that it was definitely effective because as your reader, that was certainly communicated. And I am curious, just as far as being the editor of this type of project, as well as a contributor, what what was it like? How do sharing stories like this help conversion therapy survivors? And you already sort of alluded to what your hope was for the readers and to be sort of put in the place where you all were that contributed to this collection. But do you think that the process of doing this, would you describe it as healing, or would you give it a different sort of term as far as what it meant to develop this collection and see how it's been received?
Yeah, I think for a number of contributors that they did describe this as, cathartic. I think also like the editing process, like writing's so personal, right? And whenever we put on paper, we take,
Mm-hmm.
as not just always a reflection of ourselves, but sometimes we feel like it is us. And so having to deal to sort of like man, my edits and explain to people, this is not you, this is, the story that we're telling, and we're going to make this as, strong or compelling as possible by how we tell it and how we frame it. Again, with using different sort of like literary strategies, like show, don't tell, that kind of thing. But with that being said, of course, you're dealing with really personal and sometimes, traumatic experiences. And so with that, these stories have to be handled, and the editing process had to be handled with like immense care. So
Mm-hmm.
working with people, and seeing that as we were going, like this was of course like touching wounds, and this was of course like hurting to bring up or dredge up these feelings or these emotions, these memories that in some cases, you forget certain things, and then all of a sudden it just sort of comes to you as you're working with someone else, especially sort of like triangulating the experience, you, them, and the experience, and just talking about it. And so that was, again, like I think both like a really challenging but also a really rewarding aspect of it. And I think a lot of people, well, I shouldn't say I know that a lot of people communicated that it was, helpful in that sense. I mean, even right now, yesterday was the deadline for my next edited collection, and people were saying, hey, like even if the story's not included, like it's been, again, cathartic or healing or whatever term they might have used, and so that's super cool, and I'm super glad. And I think that writing in general really does that, and not just for this, but again for across context. But beyond that, like for survivors who are reading the collection, I hope that they see themselves in some way, shape, or form. The experiences, because they are so varied within the collection, that they resonate with one or two or all of them potentially. And I've had readers offer feedback and said like every story made me cry, and yeah, editing every story made me cry while I was doing the editing. So it makes sense. But I think, yeah, again, the intended audience obviously is survivors, but beyond that, it goes to the queer community, and beyond that, it goes to religious communities, and beyond that, it just goes to everyone, right? But if I were to think of like sort of an intended audience, it's survivors and queer folks. But because I think that part of conversion therapy, for queer experiences, particularly experiences within the church, we as queer people, we don't all undergo conversion therapy. And for me, I did. But for every queer person, I would argue, and not just within the church, but beyond, I would say that they've undergone conversion practices. And that is to say that any practice, any message communicated, any, action taken, whatever that tries to align someone with the heteronormative model, whether it be, in regards to gender or sexuality. If I say to a young boy, like, don't sit like that, you look like a sissy. If I say to a young girl, you need to be wearing a dress, not that, a football uniform, whatever, like change. And then saying like, critiquing how someone talks or how someone walks or whatever, these little messages that people accumulate over time, these are what we call conversion practices. They are trying to convert someone into something that they're not. So they're just being themselves, whatever that self might be at that time, but instead they're being told change. And so all of this, queer people, all of us throughout our lives have undergone conversion practices, whether we recognize them or not as conversion practices, but I would argue that they are. And I think even, again, I'm not trying to make everyone feel included, but I think even for some straight people, right, where a young boy isn't aligning with what it means to be, stereotypically masculine, or a young girl isn't aligning with the stereotypical definition of femininity, and they're told, you need to act this way, and then someone's trying to push them in that direction, and, over time they either conform or, don't conform to that. These are, again, conversion practices. These are attempts to straighten people out and to homogenize in a very particular way that is socially agreed upon by society, but again, oftentimes by the church. And so that's what I think about these stories. I hope that people see these different conversion practices in, action in these stories and say, maybe I had something that was a little bit similar. Not saying that everyone went through conversion therapy, because not everyone did, but a lot of people did undergo conversion practices. And so to see that and recognize for what it is and the violence for what it is, I think that's important. And that's what I hope that, again, this is for conversion therapy survivors, but it's for queer people more generally. It's for religious people more generally, and it's for everyone after that. But again, I
Hmm.
think, or maybe ex-religious people, I think maybe more accurately, not many religious people
There's
are,
yeah,
they're
there's
just,
a Venn diagram
exactly.
somewhere,
Exactly.
right?
So all that to say, I think that I hope is, what I hope people get out of the collection, that they see themselves and that they recognize the violence for what it is, and that they do their best to take that, violence or, negative emotion out of circulation and put an end to it.
Yeah, yeah. My final question is, as are there organizations that are leading the cause to ban these sorts of practices, whether it's in Canada or the United States or other parts of North America and South America or even globally? Are there various groups that are working to God go with them if they're trying to like reform things from within. But even so, are there any particular organizations which are advocating or lobbying at the legal or other levels to ban these practices? And I know, as is mentioned in the book, a lot of these practices do sometimes just go underground, and it's not always easy to fully eradicate something like this. But are any of those sorts of social group efforts being made to discourage and to ban these practices?
Yeah, so in Canada, there's no Conversion Canada, which at this point is not necessarily disbanded, but they're not really doing the work that they're doing anymore because conversion practices are illegal in Canada now. So I think for them, there's still a lot of work to be done because no one has been tried for continuing to practice conversion therapy in Canada, and there are a number of organizations that continue to practice conversion therapy. So there is more work to do, but I think their express goal was to get it illegal, and now again, it's a different story what you do after something's been outlawed. In the States, in Australia, there's a lot of really good work happening. There's a lot of really phenomenal activists there. I'm not as well connected in the Australian scene, but I know a number of people who are, and actually one of the contributors is really active. And they just had a victory recently. I think it was in one of the regions of Australia. It's now banned for, I don't know if, I think it's for everyone. I don't even think it's just for minors. Whereas in the US, a lot of the laws that are in place in the various states that it's illegal, those are only for minors. And so there are some organizations there. I don't really know, to be honest, like what they're really doing. Like I,
Sure.
there's a lot of
Yeah, and I mean
politics,
that
and I don't
that's
really know. So
yeah. And that's totally fair. That's beyond your jurisdiction.
A few moments later.
We did have a little bit of a technical snag right as we were wrapping things up, and we were talking about some of the various groups that are doing things to ban conversion therapy in various jurisdictions. But I did just want to thank you for coming on the show and for talking a bit about the book. Again, the book is called Shame, Sex, Attraction: Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy. It's available wherever you can find books. Lucas, where can people find anything else you might be working on? Where can they find you online if they want to follow you and your various pursuits online? Anything you want to plug right now?
yeah, so I'm on most social media. I'm technically on TikTok. I just don't know how to. I've never even tried to make a video. Anyway, I am on Instagram, Luke Slim Dunk Wilson, Blue Sky, Luke Slim Dunk Wilson, Threads, Luke Slim Dunk Wilson, and I try to keep it consistent. And on Twitter, I'm Wilson_FW. But otherwise, just like academia.edu, LinkedIn, Facebook, that kind of stuff. But right now, working on another edited collection. This time it's about queer experiences at Christian colleges, universities, and seminaries. I would like to say that I'm still accepting application or submissions, but I don't think that I am. I think at this point it's kind of yesterday was the deadline, and so who am I to extend it any further? I probably shouldn't. But if anyone really is interested and wants to reach out, then I can always, we can chat. But otherwise, yeah, that'll be the next collection I'm working on through University of Georgia Press, and that'll be coming out sometime either next year or early 2027. But I think 2026. I think it'll come out in 2026. So we'll figure it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. And then I'm really glad that stories like these are sort of contributing to a growing body of work, whether it's academic or sort of popular press. Like the more of these sorts of stories become available to folks, I think that means that the people will see themselves in the stories, and the people that don't know that these sorts of things are happening, well, ignorance is much less of an excuse anymore. So thank you for working on this particular project and sharing it with the world. And thank you for coming on the show to talk about it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.